Due to my personal gaming history, MS-DOS is another platform that definitely requires the upgrade to 10 games per episode, but like with the NES, I didn't really play much of games I didn't enjoy, so let's continue my DOS nostalgia tripping in regular mode. We start with a couple of games from before I had my own PC, which I'm not completely sure I would call enjoyable in either case, but definitely memorable. First, the better game based on the blockbuster movie Who Framed Roger Rabbit, this one by Disney Software. Hair-raising Havoc is a side-scrolling puzzle-based adventure game, which doesn't follow the movie's plotline but rather exploits the dynamic of Roger Rabbit and little baby Herman, introduced in the first couple of minutes of the movie. It's definitely a valiant attempt at giving the movie's fans more of the actual cartoon action you didn't really get to see more than a taste of in the film. Too bad it's brutally difficult. The basic idea is to interact with objects in each area in such a way as to always give you an alternative method to exiting the area.
What a cute fishy!
If the Rube Goldberg-like thinking is not your forte, the harsh time limit in the game will not help you a lot. As Wikipedia mentions, your PC's processor speed varies the game's running speed, making it impossible to play on faster systems. Luckily, DOSbox helps with this issue, but it still doesn't make the game any easier. But the fantastic animations and voice samples make the game worth a try.
Here you go!
Perhaps better known from the first PlayStation and perhaps even 3DO for those of you who had one back in the day, Cyberia, not to be confused with the more recent Cyberia with an S, is a half-adventure, half-action game made fully in 3D graphics, developed by Zaytrix Entertainment, who later became known for their Redneck Rampage games. The adventuring parts of Cyberia are presented in a style reminiscent of Alone in the Dark, but you don't actually have a real freedom of movement as you can only use predefined pathways to walk between areas.
Please enter identification. KY. Welcome back to Cyberia.
Sometimes you come across puzzles which might require you to disarm bombs or hack into computers and whatnot, but you can use your suit's scanners to help figuring out the puzzles. The action parts of Cyberia require you to either fly a fighter jet or use a gun turret to shoot down enemy aircraft. At some point you are introduced to a virus cleaning robot which you are also able to control, but I have never actually bothered to play the game that far. Having said that, Cyberia is actually a fairly immersive game, but it is also an infuriatingly linear game, which can only be played in a certain way, which can become a bit boring after a while. Still, it's a perfect representation of gaming in the early 90s, warts and all, and you have to hold some respect for it, even if you don't like it. Which I do. If you're one of those people who were envious of your friend's Super NES and their Super Mario Kart, chances are that you eventually got your dose on the MS-DOS with Wacky Wheels, released by Apogee in 1994. Although Beavisoft certainly tried to differentiate Wacky Wheels from its obvious source of inspiration by the less copyrighted characters racing with lawnmowers instead of carts, it really was the only proper Mario Kart challenger at that point. At least the only one I knew of, even though it was a couple of years late into the game. The 3D engine used by Wacky Wheels is slightly better than the one in Super Mario Kart, which is partly why I came to enjoy this more. But it also has some memorable music and sound effects which made the experience different enough, and somewhat funnier than Mario Kart. Of course, you also get several multiplayer game modes, including what's basically a deathmatch mode called Wacky Shootout. What Mario Kart couldn't do is get people to play multiplayer games by linking computers via a modem or a serial link cable, which made Wacky Wheels fairly popular in early LAN sessions. Those were the days. Anyway, if you want to relive your favorite part of the 90s with Wacky Wheels, you can buy it from GOG.com or Steam. There's also a sequel/remake called Wacky Wheels HD, available at itch.io, but I'm not exactly sure about the officiality of it. Still worth a look. In 1992, a game was released by LucasArts that somehow defied logic and all rules of game-making norms, as it surpassed its predecessor in size, graphics and sound. Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis was the first official sequel to The Last Crusade, and followed Henry Jones Jr.'s adventures in archaeology in an even more awe-inspiring manner than the previous game. Unfortunately for most of us indie fans, the game was not based on a movie, and for many years it was contemplated whether Lucasfilm were even considering making a movie out of Fate of Atlantis. Obviously it never did, and likely never will, because the story is set in 1939, which is roughly a year after the events of The Last Crusade, and it's a bit late to get Harrison Ford to play his role for that time period anymore.
Maybe. How'd you like today's newspaper?
As usual, Jones is accompanied by a female co-adventurer, this time going by the name of Sophia Hapgood. And similarly to Lucasfilm Games' previous titles, you can switch between the two protagonists after a certain point in the game, if you choose to play the game in Team Path mode.
There it goes.
And I still feel the presence of Atlantis through... May I present Narab Sal?
There are two other modes that you can play.
Of
The Wits path with a lot more tricky puzzles, and the Fists path with a lot more fighting
Bjorn
sequences.
Heimdall, I believe.
Maybe we should pay him a visit. What do you say?
In hindsight, there are certain very
thought
game-specific
you'd
types
never
of
ask.
situations and story plot devices that would never have worked in a movie setting, nor do I think this all could have even been possible to translate onto the silver screen in 1992-93 with enough credibility, but then again, plenty of games have been turned into movies with less source material since. Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis is a classic point-and-click adventure which should be experienced on a DOS PC, or maybe a Macintosh, if only to save you the trouble of switching between 11 floppy disks on the Amiga. This one is also available on GOG and Steam, if you still haven't played it for some reason.
Wow, some bridge.
Hi, Indy.
In this episode we have two Finnish games, just to keep the name and the percentage up. The first one is a rather peculiar racing game called Rally Sport, with a hyphen. Developed and released by Jukka Jäkälä in 1996, Rally Sport was an underground hit in Finland, largely thanks to its unique viewpoint and physics modeling. I tend to revisit Rally Sport once every 3 or 4 years, which I admit isn't nearly enough for this game, but it's always hilarious in all its 90s-ishness, if that's even a word. There's a bunch of oddly titled tracks and a few different cars to race, and you can race against time, a human opponent, or a computer opponent in various difficulty levels. The two-player mode can also be played in a single screen with time penalties similarly to Rally Speedway, or in a split-screen mode. Admittedly, it's not the most comfortable racing game to get accustomed to due to its quirky physics modeling, but it's part of what makes Rally Sport the game that it is. It's games like this that really endeared me to DOS gaming as opposed to PlayStation and other consoles at the time, and it's games like this that keep me coming back to old DOS games on a regular basis. Of course, then there's the other end of the spectrum with proper classics such as the first two Eye of the Beholder games. I think I must have played the first game the most, but to be honest, I'm not completely sure of it. The Eye of the Beholder trilogy was part of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons franchise's Forgotten Realms series. Although the AD&D computer game series had launched even before the 1980s, the first Beholder was the first game in the entire franchise to use a 3D dungeon crawling style similar to FTL's Dungeon Master. While the Eye of the Beholder series has been criticized for not properly following the rules of either the Dungeon Master format or even the longer established Dungeons & Dragons rules, it acts as a pretty good compromise to get the atmosphere right with graphics and sounds and get most of the gameplay good enough. If you caught the bit about Dungeon Master in my first Atari ST episode, you might remember that I prefer the Eye of the Beholder games to Dungeon Master. It's mostly because I don't get lost nearly as easily here as in Dungeon Master due to the more varied graphics, but also because I think Eye of the Beholder explains itself a little bit better. The plotline is also clearer from the start if you feel such a thing necessary. Despite my preference to the Beholder games, I have never made any significant progress in either of the first two games, but I still enjoy them for the little while that I play them every few years or so, trying to beat my previous record. In this sense, nostalgia is a great tool for measuring the greatness of a game, because you don't even need to be good at it to recognize the game's value. Eye of the Beholder definitely holds that value high, and if you're a dungeon crawling fan in general, these games are certainly worth a look. There's one particular DOS game that I connect with an old friend of mine that I haven't really been in any real contact in ages, but back before the turn of the millennium, we were unbelievably hooked on Life and Death 2: The Brain. The first Life and Death used really harsh CGA graphics, so we never really got into that one, but the sequel looked as amazing as it was gruesome, yet fascinating. Greetings to Hare if you ever stumble upon this video. Those of you who have played the brutally hilarious Surgeon Simulator from 9 years ago and its more recent sequel, the two Life and Death games let you operate a patient, but the Life and Death games are more serious doctoring simulations. First, you need to see your patient and make a diagnosis based on a few different actions you are allowed to make, and then if painkillers and rest don't help, you're going into the operation room unless you make a false diagnosis. In Life and Death 2, The Brain, you have to deal with things such as subdural hematoma, brain tumors, and aneurysms, but not limited to those. Sometimes patients can be cured simply by prescribing aspirin, but there are even drug addicts you need to consider. At best, Life and Death 2: The Brain is a wonderful piece of edutainment, but it's also a surprisingly entertaining game with lots of dark humor. Unfortunately, if you want to be successful in the game, you do need to read lots of text, but it does pay off eventually. Just don't go performing brain surgery after your first successful virtual brain tumor operation here. Now I'm a bit late in including this one in the series since the first sequel was featured in the last Windows episode, but better late than never. Here's the original, The Need for Speed. I have this game in my collection as a big box special edition version, which isn't perhaps considered to be as classic as the original version, but there are a couple of more tracks here, as well as a time of day selector and the Windows 95 support. I had a severe obsession about this game back in 1994-95 when I had my first PC. I used to play this with my brother and we played this game for weeks, maybe even months, before we managed to beat all of the circuits and open road races in the game and unlock the Las Vegas circuit. But our favorite part of the Need for Speed was always the open road segments, which were played in 3 parts because they made the game feel more realistic in a way, and they reminded us of another old favorite racing game, Test Drive, which will eventually be featured in a C64 episode. In the Need for Speed you have 8 cars to choose from which my favorite was always the black Lamborghini Diablo. There are options to race against a single opponent, or a number of virtual opponents, or against the clock. The tournament mode is what you play when you want to complete the game in order to unlock the Las Vegas circuit, but you need to finish first on every single track to achieve that goal. The peculiar thing about the original Need for Speed compared to all its sequels is that for the most part you cannot drive off-road. There are barriers to prevent you from taking shortcuts. This is also how the game resembles Test Drive more than its own sequels. Another nod towards Test Drive is the inclusion of police cars in the open road segments, who can give you warnings or speeding tickets if they catch you. Compared to the later games in the series though, the cars don't really control as well here. And it might feel shockingly bad to play this if you have never played it before. For that exact reason though, it makes the nostalgia factor for this game even higher than for the later games in the series. What I felt at the time was probably the most overhyped puzzle game ever, was a game I grudgingly admitted was a bit genius and stupidly addicting. Sierra's offering into the Hall of Fame of puzzle games, we have The Incredible Machine from 1993. If you're familiar with the concept of Rube Goldberg machines, which are contraptions designed to perform simple tasks through overly complicated ways through chain reactions, named after the cartoonist, The Incredible Machine lets you puzzle out as many as 80 of these contraptions. Although the game starts off with a series of simple enough tutorial puzzles, the game becomes rather convoluted surprisingly quickly. As Wikipedia informs us, the game was originally going to be developed by Electronic Arts for the Commodore 64 in 1984, when the development company Dynamics was founded by Jeff Tunnell, the producer of The Incredible Machine, along with Damon Sly. While being under Electronic Arts in the 1980s, Dynamics did a bunch of classic games such as Stellar 7, Project Firestart, and Arctic Fox. Dynamics was bought by Sierra Online in 1990, which allowed them to start working on The Incredible Machine in 1992, but then the game had to be done for the DOS PCs and Macintosh. Also, a 3DO version was produced. The game quickly had an expanded version as the even more Incredible Machine, which featured double the amount of puzzles to be solved, as well as a more cartoony spin-off called Sid and Al's Incredible Tunes, both of which were released the same year as the original game. While The Incredible Machine is at best the progressing puzzle game that it is, it also features a free-form machine creation mode in which you are allowed to play with all the elements featured in the game with no set goal. You can also create your own puzzles and save them on disk for annoying your friends with later on.
Phew!
The Incredible Machine spawned a fairly long-standing franchise, with the last official game in the series being published in 2011. Jeff Tunnell also created a spiritual successor called Contraption Maker in 2014, and it is available through Steam. but my nostalgia for the original Incredible Machine is largely due to its very specific style of graphics and sounds, and it's one of the games I used to play with my childhood friend who had an IBM Aptiva, and the first two games in this episode. Last, and perhaps by some standards the least, we have another Finnish game, which I can easily claim to have been the most addicted to from all the games in this episode. The game is more internationally known as Fight of the Sumo-Hoppers, although the original Finnish title, Hyppyhäkkien Sumopaini, doesn't quite literally translate as that, though for all intents and purposes it's close enough. This 1996 independent gem was written by one Tuomas Korppi, while studying at the Helsinki University as an antidote for the standardized form of pretty but contentless games. Obviously, being a mock sumo wrestling type game, Sumo-Hoppers are to be played by two human players, although playing against a computer opponent is also an option. You can only control each player's legs by using a set of 8 different keys on the opposite sides of the keyboard to bend and unbend your knees and turning them in different angles. The way your legs move around is based on some sort of weird physics instead of the usual solid angling, so your feet just keep on dangling like loose sausages while you're trying to control them, which really makes the game what it is. Because of this, though, you'll never be able to get completely comfortable with the controls. A single match might only take 10 seconds at best, but the insane pacing and silliness of the game can easily have you at it long enough to notice that you've played 200 matches all of a sudden. The game's longevity is helped by a few different variables, such as a bunch of different terrains, a torpedo effect to simulate a randomized wind factor, and a slippery ground effect, which was never properly finished, so it doesn't actually work all the time. The two Sumo-Hoppers' colors can also be changed and have the guys look even simpler than you see here, but this is how we always played it back in the day and still do.